Welcome back to our SOS Couples Course, Session 4. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer. Then we're going to introduce, pick up where we left off last time, rehearse a couple of things, just so that we can get a running start at today. We'll jump into the new text, the new scene in the book, the new scene at hand, and we'll continue to hopefully be learning what the Lord has placed here for our learning. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, thank you so much for this time today. Thank you for the book of Song of Songs. Thank you for how it informs us and equips us regarding marriage. We pray that you would illumine our hearts and our minds, quicken our spirits as we look into some of the topics at hand here today. May you continue to help us learn so that we can invest in our marriages and bring honor and glory to you and blessing to our homes. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, again, thanks again for tuning in. Hopefully this will be a blessing as we work through some of these big concepts. Now, just by way of reminder, last time, if you recall, we looked at the rest of Chapter 2 and the first chunk of Chapter 3. And what we did is we looked at the engagement scene up in Lebanon. Recall, Solomon is living down in Jerusalem. That's, of course, where he is. Shulamite is from Lebanon. And last time we looked at this idea that when Solomon went up to Lebanon to see Shulamite, he was essentially going up there to propose. The actual popping the question, if you will, the engagement scene, is recorded in Chapter 2 of the book. And recall that they used the imagery of a relationship being somewhat akin to a vineyard or a garden that had begun to bloom and blossom and had just started to ripen. And they were ready for the next step, the step of commitment in their relationship. And this is, of course, exactly what they do. And there was, however, if you recall, Shulamite, who, after Solomon poses the question, says, "Hey, will you marry me? Rise up, come away," right? Well, she hesitates. Shulamite hesitates, not because she doesn't love Solomon, because she's not attracted to Solomon, but rather she does have some fears and concerns, some insecurities. Perhaps she had viewed some of the weaknesses, potential weaknesses of Solomon, and she wanted assurances that their relationship would be invested in, it would be prioritized, it would be protected from the foxes that can come in and spoil the vines. And we developed that idea last time, and that was your homework, was to sit down and to think through where your marriage might be vulnerable. What are some weeds from within and foxes from without that can come and steal the fruit or choke out the fruit from your marriage? And so that was your assignment last time, and yet we found out that not only after he pops the question, she hesitates, she does ultimately say yes, she will marry him, but then they separate, right? That's where we're going to pick up the story today, is they separate because that was pretty common in the Jewish betrothal period. After they are promised to wed, well, now there is a separation. He will go back to Jerusalem, prepare a place for her. She will stay up in Lebanon, preparing herself and readying herself for the wedding. Well, the first part of Chapter 3 begins with a sleepless night. It's a nightmare, a dream that Shulamite has, which is really exposing some deeper fears and concerns of her heart. And we talked about that last time. We're going to revisit a little bit today, more so next session. But where we're going to pick up the story today is in Chapter 3, verse 6, and we're going to hopefully get all the way through Chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, what this scene is number one, Shulamite's arrival in Jerusalem, because Solomon has been down there preparing a place. Apparently the wedding is ready to go. The palace or wherever she will be staying is prepared, and it's time for him to go and fetch the bride. And so the entourage that brings Shulamite from Lebanon up in the north down to Jerusalem in the south, that is recorded in the first few verses of our section here. And so we're going to see the arrival of Shulamite in Jerusalem. Then we're going to see the wedding ceremony itself, the marriage ceremony, which is just really briefly touched upon. Simple ceremony, but some profound symbolism and significance. We'll see that at the tail end of Chapter 3. And then we're going to go ahead and jump in, if we can make it that far, and get through all of Chapter 4, which is essentially the wedding night. This is their honeymoon night. This is their first sexual encounter. And there is a lot of practical stuff here for our learning. So, if you got your Bibles, let's begin by reading the passage, chapter 3, verses 6 to 10. The Bible says this: "Who is this that comes out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the powders of the merchant? Behold, his bed, which is Solomon's. 80 valiant men are about it, and the valiant of Israel. They all hold swords, being expert in war. Every one has his sword upon his thigh, because of fear in the night. King Solomon made himself a chariot of the wood of Lebanon. He made the pillars thereof of silver, and the bottom thereof of gold, the covering of it of purple, the midst thereof being paved with love for the daughters of Jerusalem. Go forth, O you daughters of Zion, and behold King Solomon with the crown wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals, in the day of the gladness of his heart." Now, in this section, what we're seeing, particularly verses 6 to 10, that is the entourage that I just mentioned. Now, again, look up on the screen and recall the map here. Lebanon, up here in the northern reaches of the nation of Israel, is where Shulamite is from. Recall that Jerusalem is the capital city. That's where Solomon is living. And so he, in, again, common Jewish wedding practice, they would become betrothed, then they would separate for a period of time until the place was ready, where they would ultimately live after the marriage. And so it's time for Solomon to go and fetch Shulamite. And that's exactly what he does. And they go, and she is brought from Lebanon to Jerusalem. And verse 6 opens with, it's a feminine plural, probably the daughters of Jerusalem are the ones speaking in verse 6 when they say, "Who or what is this coming up out of the wilderness, like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all the powders of the merchant?" Now, what that is, it's a rhetorical question where what the daughters of Jerusalem are doing is they, probably in Jerusalem, are witnessing this entourage approaching the city. And it's obvious. It's big. There's like pillars of smoke, myrrh and frankincense that is being burnt and rising from this entourage like great grand pillars of smoke. And the point is, they're impressed by this entourage, and they ask, "What is this?" Well, in verse 7 and following, now it's feminine singular. This would be Shulamite who speaks. And she is now explaining to the daughters of Jerusalem what it is they're witnessing. And she describes this elaborate, it's translated a bed in verse 7. It's translated a chariot in verse 9. Some translations will say sedan chair. Others will use the term palanquin. But as you can see pictured on the screen, it's essentially this elaborate, it's kind of a common, ancient Near Eastern, even Far East, in China. It was a way of carrying. This kind of covered couch is a way to carry royalty. And royalty, or the upper class nobility, the wealthy, who had multiple servants and could afford such a palanquin or sedan chair, would be carried about on this as a symbol of their status. Well, as the daughters of Jerusalem are witnessing this entourage approach the city, they ask the question, "What is this?" Well, Shulamite responds, and she answers with an elaborate description. And you can tell she's very proud of this. She's very impressed with the way Solomon has elaborately retrieved her from Lebanon and brought her with this entourage down to Jerusalem. But look at again the details. Verse 7, Shulamite speaking, she says, "Behold, look at this, the bed which is Solomon's. 80 valiant men are about it, of the valiant of Israel." Now the word valiant there is actually in Hebrew, gibor. Giborim is sometimes translated mighty men. It's believed by some to actually be essentially a group that was originally put together by David, but by the time of Solomon, you see that word, it should basically come into your mind. This would be Solomon's secret service, his personal bodyguard. Solomon may be with this entourage, or he has simply sent the entourage to pick her up, and he is awaiting in Jerusalem. Either way, he is the one who has made preparation, and he is the one who had this palanquin, this sedan chair, built, and he has done it in such a way that it is elaborate, it is gorgeous, but there's 60 armed men, the elite of the army of Israel, that are there to protect her and to bring her to the city of Jerusalem. So again, the whole point is there's an elaborate retrieval, display of wealth, and display of power, and all of this meant to shower protection upon her, provision upon her, to help treat Shulamite as special, the princess, or soon-to-be queen that she is. Verse 8 says that these 60 armed men are all armed with swords, every one of them, because of fear in the night. And the idea is they are guarding her throughout the day and the night. She is under constant watch care. Verse 9, it says, King Solomon made himself a chariot of the wood of Lebanon. Don't forget, where is she from? Lebanon. What did her dream expose? And what did some of the earlier narratives of chapter 1 and 2 expose? She's insecure about coming to Jerusalem. She's a fish out of water down in the city, the capital city. She's a country girl from the regions of Lebanon. And so it seems, do you see the kind of the personal touch here, where Solomon, in retrieving her, gives this elaborate bodyguard to protect her, but he also builds this special chariot, spending lots of money on it, but it's first made out of wood. Where's the wood from? Lebanon. It's a little taste of home for Shulamite. But after he built it out of wood, it says he overlays it. Verse 10, the pillars thereof are of silver, the bottom thereof is of gold, the covering of purple. Now, obviously, gold, silver, we get that. I really feel sorry for the guys that had to carry this thing. It must be super heavy. But anyways, it's made of silver, gold, and purple. Now, you might already know this. You might not. Purple is throughout history, is been associated with royalty. It's sometimes called the color of royalty. But do you know why that is? Purple is the color of royalty because it was extremely expensive to manufacture. There were two different ways to make purple dye in antiquity. When it comes to this area of the world, the more predominant way was that purple was made by the Phoenicians. In fact, the word Phoenicia is a Greek word for the cities of Tyre and Sidon and the region just north of Israel, modern-day Lebanon. But in antiquity, it was known as Phoenicia, and it's actually a Greek term that means purple, the purple people. Because the Phoenicians were very extensive traders, and they built their commercial empire largely with the trading of purple dye. And what they had to do is they would capture a particular type of mollusk. It's like a sea snail that is predominant in the Mediterranean. They would capture, get this, 1,200 mollusks in order to extract from this mollusk a sort of natural purple dye, and they would have to take 1,200 of these things in order to manufacture 1 single ounce of purple dye to dye clothes, etc., cloth. And so it was extremely expensive. That's why purple became known as the color of royalty. The point is, this is elaborate. What Solomon here, not Paul, what am I thinking? What Solomon has done to prepare for Shulamite. And she's proud of it, because the daughters of Jerusalem say, hey, wow, what is this? And she's like, well, let me show you. Let me show you what my sweetie has done for me. And she's proud of the fact that he has treated her so well. But look at the end of verse 10. Not only is it made of gold and silver and purple, but it says the midst thereof, or probably translated, could also be translated the inside. So inside of it, this section up here where the person sitting and being carried in the sedan chair would actually be looking at, it says the inside is paved with love for the daughters of Jerusalem. What in the world does that mean? Well, there's a couple of different interpretive options, and we're not entirely sure. It could be an adverb, that it was lovingly prepared by Solomon, that he did something on the inside to kind of put personal touches in there. One suggestion that kind of appeals to me, that some scholars have made, is that we should take that as a noun, that he actually put love, as in love letters, little notes, little pieces of writing, or, some kind of, romantic graffiti, for lack of a better term, on the inside. In other words, he did something, whatever Solomon did, he did something to make the inside of this very comfortable, very personal, very special. That while Shulamite was being escorted, retrieved from Lebanon, coming down to Jerusalem, that she would be pampered and treated very well. And so, but notice at the end of verse 10, it says that he has done this. All of this is prepared. Why? For the daughters of Jerusalem. That's not a throwaway phrase. It's actually a very important thing. In other words, why has Solomon gone all out in retrieving this elaborate retrieval of Shulamite? Why has he done this? Well, he has done it, yes, to show his love for Shulamite, but also to show his love for Shulamite to the daughters of Jerusalem. Don't forget what Solomon said earlier in chapter 2 when Shulamite says, I am as a lily of the valley. And Solomon said, no, 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 no. You're not one lily amongst a valley of lilies. You are the one lily amongst thorns. Do you remember that? He's describing how she is one of a kind. She is utterly unique. She is in a category all to herself. And the idea here is, I think, that we saw introduced back in chapter 2 is again front and center here in chapter 3, verse 10, where Solomon wants it to be crystal clear to the whole world, all of the watching world, especially the daughters of Jerusalem that are the primary rivals of Shulamite, that are the ones that were perhaps hoping at one time that they would have, they would catch the eye of the young king, and maybe they would become queen. And Solomon says, nope, it's Shulamite. She is the love of my life. She is my one and only. And that is important for us. I think there's a practical lesson there. We've talked about it already, so we don't need to develop it. But kind of what was mentioned earlier in chapter 2 when Shulamite describes how Solomon took her to the banqueting house and his banner over her was love. And the idea is it was bold, it was obvious, it was declared to everybody that Solomon is in love with Shulamite. And, you know, there's something to be said about that. That not all women like public displays of affection. They kind of get a little nervous or, you know, embarrassed at that perhaps. But there is a source of security for a woman when her husband is elaborately declaring to her, and by implication everyone around her, that he's taken. That his heart is his wife's. That she has his affection. That he doesn't have wandering eyes. It can be very frustrating. I counseled a couple one time where every time they went out to eat, the husband would, all that he would do is flirt with the waitresses. And it used to drive his wife crazy because she was so insecure. She's like, why are you looking at them? Why are you laughing at them? Why are you talking to them? Like, I'm sitting right here. Do you not see me? And it undermined their relationship. She became very insecure in their relationship because and as I tried to bring it to his attention, he was just like, well, it's just who I am. I just like to flirt with people. And I said, well, I don't care if that's how you are. You're being stupid. You're driving a wedge between you and your wife. Do you realize when you do that, what that's communicating to her? But flip that on its head. I love going out to eat with my wife, and we love seeing old couples that are sitting over in a booth. And rather than, and you know, it's kind of a small thing, but my wife and I, whenever we go out to eat, we like sitting in booths. Why? Because we can kind of cuddle. We can get a little bit closer. And, you know, rather than sitting across the table from each other, we kind of like to have, you know, that cozy little cuddle in the corner of the booth. And, you know, we keep it under wraps, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not like we go all grotesque on anybody. But the point is, we like to show affection towards one another, and we love it when we see an old couple that's been married for 40, 50, 60 years, and there they are in a corner booth. And their love and affection for one another seems to have not diminished. It's only grown. And there's just, we love seeing that. And it's kind of a source of security for a relationship to have a public display, not gross, I mean, you know what I'm saying, but public display of affection. It's good for that couple to where they are in private or in public. Either way, they feel secure because they are loved and everybody sees it. On the other hand, a lot of affairs start when, I mean, I can tell you stories, and I mean, they are not fun stories, but where a couple has lost this. They're not showing affection. Rather, it's the opposite. They're out in public, and there's a frown on their face. They're obviously discontent. They're obviously frustrated. And people aren't stupid. We can totally read your face. We totally see what's going on in your heart. But it makes a marriage vulnerable. I can tell you stories of an unhappy man or an unhappy woman who somebody else sees that they're unhappy because it's obvious. So what do? They zero in. They swoop in. They start building relationship. There's an emotional affair that takes place. And then often it leads to a physical affair, a sexual affair. The point is, it is a safeguard to your relationship to broadcast to one another in the world that you're in love, you're smitten, you're taken. Your wife, your spouse is your one and only. That's important. Now, in verse 11, so in verse 10, we see here this idea of Shulamite being carried in this entourage, all of this prepared by Solomon for the daughters of Jerusalem. But then notice verse 11. It's addressed to those daughters of Jerusalem. It says, "Go forth, O you daughters of Zion," or Jerusalem. "Behold King Solomon with the crown wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals, in the day of the gladness of his heart." In other words, the daughters of Jerusalem are invited to witness the wedding ceremony. Now, the wedding ceremony itself in Jewish culture was very simple. But it was a simple ceremony. They would typically come, they would gather beneath the huppah, it's called. It's kind of a little covering lattice sort of thing, draped with curtains. I mean, they can build them different ways. But they would gather under there. They would basically make vows of faithfulness one to another. And then that was pretty much the ceremony itself. And then they would have a feast. And during the feast, they would make these little, as you can see pictured here, they would make these little crowns. And they would crown the husband and wife, the groom and the bride, and they would sing and dance and eat and drink, and it was just a festival time, lots of fun stuff. But they would crown them as the king and queen of a new household. Now, obviously, when it says here that Solomon's crown, it's probably here not talking about his kingly crown. Rather, it's probably talking about the festival crown that was given, even to this day. Many Jewish weddings will still do this. They will make these little crowns, and they will crown the man and wife as king and queen. And it's a very simple idea, but it's profound in its symbolism. The idea is that every time there's a wedding, the rabbis used to say, that every time there's a wedding or a marriage, it's the beginning of a new civilization. Is that you have a king, you have a queen. If God blesses, you'll have all these little minions running around. And as a result, you are forming a new family unit. And notice the symbolism here is rather profound. It says, go look at Solomon. In other words, the daughters of Jerusalem are said, hey, go look, witness this, because Solomon is now a taken man. He is off limits. But look as Solomon is crowned by his mother. Now, this is simply the Jewish way that even to this day, many Jewish weddings still follow this, but it's the Jewish version of what many Americans and Western cultures do when the father gives away the bride. In modern day wedding ceremonies, it's kind of a key moment in the ceremony when the father walks the bride up the aisle and then gives the bride away to the groom. The symbolism there is what we talked about last time in Genesis 2:24, that a man should leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, the two should become one flesh. Well, in our society, it's the woman that is marched up the aisle, given to the man. And it's the father of the bride typically giving away his daughter. Well, in Jewish culture, it was the reverse. They would actually give the man away, and it was the mother of the groom that would give the man away. The point is, it's communicating the same thing. That now with this marriage ceremony, the mother of the groom is stepping aside. She would crown her son and say, okay, she now, and crown the bride, and say, okay, this bride is now the most important female relationship in your life. The mother is now going to take a back seat to the wife of her son. And that's the whole point of the symbolism in our modern ceremonies, is that the father of the bride is saying, okay, he gives the bride over to the groom and says, now you have the job of protecting her, providing for her, being her head and her leader. And so he is saying to his daughter, I am no longer the most important male relationship in your life. I'm backing away. You are to give yourself to your husband now. And there's a lot of profound symbolism there. And we talked about that last time, the importance of leaving father and mother, cleave to your wife, and so the two become one flesh. The marriage ceremony is a tremendous way to symbolize the depth of commitment that a marriage vow really is. You are becoming one another's one and only. And it's really a blessed thing. And notice how it's called here in verse 11, the day of his espousals, that would be the wedding ceremony, the day of the gladness of his heart. That this is, in many ways, a wedding is a pinnacle. It's one of the milestones of life. It always has been in every culture, is because it is now an entrance into adulthood. You're entering a brand new realm of existence where you are to take a backseat and serve your spouse. And this is an incredible commitment that we need to understand that we're making. Because most people, they stand up there and they make those vows. They utter those vows in a wedding ceremony. And they don't realize the depth of those vows. And then it amazes me. They can stand there one day, make a vow of faithfulness to their wife, and then 1 year later they're getting a divorce. It's amazing to me how little credence and weight people give to a vow, when the Bible is very clear that when you make a vow, it is especially before God and witnesses, then it is something that it's almost like an addition to the laws of nature. You have now become man and wife. A new creation is being formed at that moment. You're no longer an individual. You are a couple. And you've got to get this through your head, that you are not to live as an island to yourself. Your life is, in many ways now, it is tied to to benefit and to serve your spouse. And that is the commitment that you made, whether you realize it or not. That's the commitment you made when you made vows of faithfulness to your wife or to your husband. Do not take those lightly, because the Bible says we cannot break a vow and have it go unheeded or without consequence. There's always consequences for violating our vows. And so we must take this very seriously. But with this concept of the simple ceremony but profound symbolism, what happens next, and this is what typically would happen in a marriage ceremony, a Jewish wedding, is that after the huppah, they're underneath the huppah, they make the vows, they begin the feast. At some point in the feast, the husband and wife now would retreat to the marriage tent. Sometimes this was actually, right there in the middle of the feast. Like, obviously they're alone in the tent, but it's like everybody's outside knowing what's going to happen in there. It's the first sexual encounter. Now, that is what is recorded in chapter 4. All right? Let's go ahead and read this section. We're going to read from 4:1 to 5:1, and we're going to make some basic observations here. All right? Let's just read this together. 4:1 to 5:1. Solomon speaks. He is the speaker for 95% of this chapter. Behold, verse 1, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. You have dove's eyes within your locks. Your hair is as a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which come up from the washing, whereof every one bears twins, and none is barren among them. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet. Your speech is comely. Your temples, or your profile, side of your face, cheeks, you could even say, are like a piece of pomegranate within your locks. Your neck is like the Tower of David, builded for an armory, whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Your two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. Until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. For thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in you. Verse 8, come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shinir and Hermon, from the lion's dens, from the mountains of the leopards. You have ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Now the sister there is actually a term in Hebrew that just means fond one, dear one. It doesn't mean they're literally sisters, sister and brother. We're not talking incest here. It's just a common term in Hebrew idiom to refer to a beloved one. He says, my sister, my spouse. By the way, that's the first use of spouse in the book, because they're now married. He goes on, you have ravished my heart with one of your eyes, with the one chain of your neck. How fair is your love, my sister, my spouse? How much better is your love than wine? Notice he's making the similar analogy she did back in chapter 1. He says, the smell of your ointments than all spices. Verse 11, your lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the smell of your garments is like the smell of Lebanon. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Thy plants are as an orchard of pomegranates and with pleasant fruits, campfire with spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, all with all trees of frankincense, myrrh, and aloes, with all the chief spices. A fountain of gardens, a well of living waters, and streams from Lebanon. That's Solomon. All he spoke, all from verses 1 to 15 there. Now look at verse 16. Shulamite speaks. Awake, O north wind, and come, thou south. Blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden, and eat his pleasant fruits. Now chapter 5, verse 1. I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. And then, third party speaking, I think we'll talk about it more in a second, but most likely God is the speaker here. He says, eat, O friends, drink, yea, drink abundantly, O beloved. Now, this is one of the climactic scenes in the book. It's their first sexual encounter. It can be rather graphic. We're not going to get into every single detail because, for sake of time, but what I want you to see is, first of all, boy, the poetic nature of this song is, and this section is so profound. Because number one, it serves as a filter. Because, we're talking about some delicate issues here. Their first sexual encounter. They're virgins, and this is their first sexual encounter. And there's many things to learn from this. But as much as there is a filter on this because of, using the poetic language, on the other hand, and this is where we're not going to get super deep into this, but I would encourage you as a couple to do so, is on the one hand using a poetic device, like a metaphor or a simile, to say, hey, sex is like this, is a filter on the one hand, but on the other hand, it can be a magnifying glass. If you think about the connections and the metaphors for very long, then it can become rather graphic what is going on here. This is one of those passages in the book that some people, especially, your teenage first-time reader through this book, starts getting a little bit uncomfortable about this passage. But the whole point of the passage is it's to affirm this basic reality that marital intimacy is designed and blessed by God. Marital intimacy is designed and blessed by God. God is the one who made up sex. He invented it. And it's not a dirty word. It's a good thing when it is in its proper context. Now, what I want you to see, and we're going to work back through it here real briefly, but the first 15 verses is Solomon. He takes center stage. This is the most he speaks anywhere in the book. He has a monologue of 15 verses. And the point is, he is taking the lead. As we see evidences here and there, that Shulamite's rather shy. I mean, this is their first sexual encounter. In fact, when he describes 7 different body parts of hers in verses 1 to 7 here, he summarizes several of her features. And he's describing all of the beauty as she is really undressing here. And yet he makes an allusion in verse 3. He says, your temples, your face, your cheeks are like a piece of pomegranate within your locks. And it pictures, if you know what pomegranate are, it's got a pinkish color, kind of a pink red. And the point is, that might be makeup, or it could be the fact that Shulamite is blushing. Especially if you, with couples, depends on which couples are listening to this right now, especially if this is a premarital counseling situation and you are yet to engage in your first sexual encounter. Praise the Lord that you have reserved your purity for marriage. Praise the Lord for that. But realize sex for the first time is going to be a bit awkward. That's okay. That's all right. It's normal. You're supposed to be a virgin when you get married. But the point is, it's going to be a little bit awkward. you're going to be a tad outside of your comfort zone. Don't fall prey to the idea that sex is like the movies. That it's so easy, it's so natural, it takes no work, it just happens, and everybody has fun. Not necessarily. That's not the reality of it. That's Hollywood, but it's not reality. Reality is, especially with your first sexual encounter, and especially later sexual encounters, like even if you've been married a long time, but there has been marital infidelity or something like that, and so your marriage bed has been defiled, and as a result, there's major emotional barriers to get over before physical intimacy can really be what God designed it to be. But either way, the point is, notice what Solomon is doing. He is taking it slow. He is so gentle. He is speaking. He is describing her. He is affirming her beauty. She's nervous. She is uncomfortable. And she is reluctant a little bit at first. She's blushing. I remember my wife, we used to talk about this before we got married. She was scared to death about the first time that I would see her naked. Because as we said before, 99.9% of all women that I've ever talked to are insecure about their looks. They're afraid of what you might think. They're not confident in their own beauty or physical appearance. And it doesn't matter what woman I've talked to. They're all on the same page here. They're all afraid of this. And the point is, a woman needs to feel secure and affirmed in the love and attraction of her spouse. And this is very important. And Solomon is so good here to be gentle, to be slow, to be speaking, to be affirming the beauty, and with specifics. He doesn't just say, oh, hey, you're good looking, and then leave it at that. No, he gets specific. He singles out 7 different elements to describe her beauty. And he uses all sorts of cool metaphors and stuff. We're not going to take the time to get lost in every one of them. But he's describing her beauty in all of its manifold fashion. And then he summarizes in verse 7, you are all fair, my love. There is no spot in you. You are perfect. My friends, this is what your wife wants to hear. It's incredible. It's an incredible source of insecurity when a guy, looks to his wife and says, "Whoa, wow, you're a little flat-chested there." Okay, that's not helpful. You say, "Well, you get a little round around the hips there, my friend." Okay, don't be doing that. Affirm your wife. And this is what Solomon does. Notice he describes her first in verses 1 to 7, climaxing with the phrase, you are all beautiful, no spot in you. Well, then in verse 8 and following, the pace starts picking up. Obviously, they've undressed by verse 7. But in verse 8, he says, come with me from Lebanon, my spouse. Come with me from Lebanon. It's kind of fascinating. He's almost repeating the phrase back in chapter 2, where he says, rise up and come away with me. But obviously, he's not talking about literal presence, because there she is. They're in the wedding tent together. But it makes me wonder if he is not sensing her reluctance. Because remember that in chapter 2, when she hesitated when they got engaged, we talked about that last time, he likened her to a dove hiding in the rocks, a skittish, fearful, shy sort of dove hiding in the rocks. He almost does the same thing in verses 8 and 9 here, where he says, hey, come with me from Lebanon. She's already in Jerusalem here. It's almost like she's there physically present, but mentally, emotionally, she's still afraid. She's still shy. She's still warming up to this whole idea of sex. And so he's being very slow. He's being very gentle. He's being very kind and considerate. And he says, come with me from Lebanon. I think he's saying emotionally, hey, right here. Let's be here together. And he says, look from the top of Amana, from Shinir and Hermon. Those are references to mountains. Again, it's like she's kind of a little reluctant, hiding in the rocks, just like she was back in chapter 2. And then he just continues to pour it on. He says in verse 9, you have ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. You've ravished my heart with one of your eyes. And the idea is just one quick glance, like he's just overcome with her beauty. He is smitten. He says, with one chain of your necklace. He is just enamored with the sight of his wife. And I think even ravished his heart. I think his heartbeat is picking up here. He goes on in verse 10, how fair is my love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is your love than wine, the smell of your ointments than all spices. He then goes on in verse 11, talking about her lips and the taste of her tongue. I think they've started making out by verse 11, if you know what I'm saying. And then he praises the fact in verse 12 to 15. Now, I'm going to be delicate here, okay, because we can get lost in this. But this is a poetic way of referring to her virginity. When he says, you are a garden enclosed. And the word garden, in fact, that word comes from a Persian word, and it means an enclosed area. Gardens in the ancient world were, particularly in the ancient Near East, when you have a hot sun, the garden was a place of reprieve. It was a place where you have shade because of the presence of the plants, etc. It's cooler. You have water there. It's a place of refreshment and joy. But it had to be protected, as we already said. You have to protect it with that circle of stone and wall, etc., gates. Why? Because wild animals could come in there and devour it or whatever. They needed to be carefully guarded and protected. Well, he is talking about her body as a garden enclosed. He says, you're like an orchard of pomegranates. He goes on to describe the beauties of this garden. And he's talking about her body. He's talking about her beauty. I think he's specifically talking about her virginity. And because we could go, he uses the same analogy down in verse 15. Well, he's saying the same thing with a different analogy. He's saying that you're as a fountain of gardens, a well of living water stream from Lebanon. If you were to go to the book of Proverbs, chapter 5, again, Solomon is the author there, but he talks about enjoying your wife and keeping the streams of living waters, or streams of waters, a well, W-E-L-L, the well guarded and protected. And he's talking about sexual purity before marriage and in marriage, that once you engage in sexual intercourse with your spouse, that is to be the only person you ever engage in sex with. And it is to be reserved. It is to be protected. It is to be guarded. It is a sacred thing. And he is proud of the fact that she has preserved her virginity, but she is offering it up willingly to him now. And that's verse 16. He has spoken for 15 verses. And he has been slow. He has been gentle. He has been descriptive. He has been loving. He has been kind. He has been affirming. Everything that he should be doing, he's doing. She now is on board. We'll talk about this in more detail in just a moment. But in verse 16, she now speaks, awake, O north wind, and come thou south. Blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. Verse 16 is an invitation for sexual intercourse. That's what it is. What's going on there is, again, get it. She was slow, she was reluctant, she was shy, she was fearful. He was gentle and patient and loving and kind and affirming. And how does she respond to such gentle love? Confidence. Invitation. A genuine invitation. She doesn't feel forced. She voluntarily submits and says, okay, I'm ready. And they engage in sexual intercourse. And that's the report in chapter 5, verse 1. She says, come into the garden. He says, I have come into my garden. And he talks about the joy of it, the pleasure, the ecstasy, if I can use that word, which God designed it to be that way. He says, I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I have drunk my wine with my milk. He has enjoyed this union, and so has she. There's a mutual enjoyment. There's a pleasure that God is designed for marriage. And I think that's the whole point of that last phrase, is we can take it a couple of different ways, But I think the best way to take chapter 5, verse 1, that last line, is this is God's endorsement of what's going on. He's saying, "Oh, eat, O friends, drink, yea, drink abundantly, O beloved." In other words, God has placed his stamp of approval on this sexual union. And he is saying, enjoy it. I designed it to be enjoyed, to be a vibrant place in your marriage, to be the glue, if you will, that holds your marriage together. And that's what I want to talk about for just a few minutes, is after examining the passage itself, let's get practical, all right? Let's talk sex for a few minutes. Let me make some basic observations for you. First of all, this whole idea of passion and purity, that we are to enjoy the passion of marriage, but we are to do so in God's ordained way. We are to be pure. Don't be fiddling around and doing sex outside of marriage, before marriage. You get away from pornography, masturbation, selfish, self-oriented ways of satisfying your physical cravings. Don't do it. Don't do what God has said don't do. Rather, enjoy the passion, the orgasmic ecstasy that God has designed for marriage, but do it in marriage with your spouse. And this phrase that, I forget where I first heard this, but it's been profound, it's stuck in my head ever since, regarding sexual intimacy in marriage. The devil is going to do everything he can to get you into bed before marriage, and to keep you out of bed after marriage. You see, the devil knows the power of human sexuality, and he knows how to pervert it into a dirty thing. And the reality is, this is one of the greatest areas in any of my counseling scenarios when I counsel folks, my own just study and understanding of these things. This is an area, sexual indiscretion is one of the areas that brings the most shame to an individual. And the point is, if you have been unfaithful before marriage, in marriage, if you've been unfaithful to your spouse, if you have indulged in sexual fantasy and sexual deviancy, then you're bringing baggage into your marriage. It's going to be a hurdle that you got to get over. And Satan wants to do that. He wants to pervert our minds away from the purity of biblical passion in marriage. And he wants to tell us the grass is greener on the other side. That sexual conquests and exploits are to be more enjoyed outside of marriage. And he's going to do everything he can to pervert you before marriage, but also in marriage, that he wants to ruin your sex life. He wants you to have a dissatisfied, discontent, frustrated sex life in your marriage. Why? Because that is one of, if not the most powerful tool that Satan has to erode, undermine, and destroy marriages. Is he makes one of the spouses or both, he gets you sexually dissatisfied and frustrated, discontent. You start looking elsewhere. You start indulging in pornography, masturbation. You start indulging in all of these things that are twisting your mind, stealing your heart. Before long, your spouse finds out about it. Maybe you step out, you have an affair. Maybe you don't go that far. But your wife, your husband, they find out about your unfaithfulness, and it drives an emotional wedge into your relationship that can be very difficult to remove. My friends, just live life God's way. It's the best way. It's a life without regret. It's a life with meaning, purpose, joy, and pleasure. And I want to talk about this for just a few moments before I give you a very practical homework assignment, and then we wrap it up for this session. Marital intimacy is the glue that holds a marriage together. Yet it's also the barometer of relational depth. One of the fastest ways to gauge a relationship in marriage. When I'm talking about this with marriage, in marriage counseling scenarios and couples, I often just get right down to it. I said, okay, when's the last time you had sex? How often do you have sex? What's going on? Because the point is not to be nosy. The point is to get to the reality that a good sex life is difficult. It takes a tremendous amount of emotional investment, of patience, loving care. And if you have a vibrant sex life, it's amazing how it serves like a glue for a marriage, that you can work through issues. But if you have issues, often it shows up in your sex life. Husband, if you have been a rotten husband and you have not been treating your wife very well, she doesn't feel very emotionally close to you. And so as a result, she either turns it off and she says, nope, no more sex. And she uses it as a tool of manipulation to get back at you. She gives you the cold shoulder. Or she goes ahead and submits and she says, all right, I'll have sex, but she hates every second of it. And she resents you for treating her like an object rather than a person. Oh, this is one of the easiest ways to make a marriage implode, is to have an unhealthy, unbiblical sex life. And I would venture to say, because I've done this a lot with lots of different couples, I've interviewed multiple couples, I dare to say if you're listening to this right now, there's a very high percentage that you have a pretty unsatisfied sex life, or you have some frustration in your sex life. You have some questions, you have some issues, and you need to start working it out. You need to start talking through some of these things. I want to spend just a few moments to help you understand intimacy. And then, this is a huge topic. I'm going to make another couple recommendations of resources that can go way farther than what we're going to cover in just the next few minutes in this course. But I want to introduce you to some of the big ideas. Biblical intimacy and sexual intimacy, God's way, as displayed in this chapter, in chapter 7, and throughout the book, is really important for us to understand and grasp. But you got to realize you are not the same. Man and woman were built differently, right? That's not rocket science. But when it comes down to the way that we participate and enjoy a sexual encounter, men and women are different. There can be exceptions to these general ideas, and these can be very generality, statements that I'm making. But generally speaking, men tend to be more oriented physically. Women tend to be oriented more towards emotions, emotionally and relationally. In other words, a guy can have sex without having any emotional attachment to a woman, and he can enjoy it. That is more difficult for a woman. Now, can that happen? Yeah, I think some women can do that. But the majority of time, women do not enjoy sex unless there is an emotional and relational connection with that man. Men tend to be stimulated by images and sight. We're very visual guys. We are turned on by our naked wife. Women, on the other hand, tend to be, generally speaking, stimulated by feelings, smell, touch, and words. Guys, it doesn't matter if you have blubber or a beach bod. Either way, your wife is probably not super impressed. Most women are not physically turned on by the sight of their naked husband. I mean, put away the Speedo, you know what I'm saying? It's really not going to do a whole lot for you. But now there could be exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's the case. Rather, women are much more, as we can see in this passage, he's turned on by her naked body, but she is still reluctant, and she's slow, and she's not ready for sex until he has spoken for 15 verses. And he has described her, and he has spoken, and he has touched her, and he smells her, and he tells her about how awesome she is and beautiful she is. Now she's warming up to it. You got to get this through your head, guys. Men tend to be able to initiate sex anytime and anywhere, at the drop of a hat. Women initiate sex less frequently, and they take longer to get in the mood, as we say. We need to understand this about each other. Men also are quick to respond sexually and difficult to distract during sex. We kind of like, full steam ahead, and it's like trying to stop a freight train. Most guys are that way when it comes to a sexual encounter. Women, on the other hand, are much slower, tend to be much slower. They respond more slowly, and they're easy to get distracted. If a woman does not feel like she's alone or safe or with the door locked and they are secure and no one's going to walk in on them, and, then maybe she can get in the mood. If there is any sort of distraction, if there's dirty dishes in the sink, if there's a child screaming outside the door, if any of that is happening, a woman is much more easily distracted and has a harder time getting focused and engaging in sexual intercourse. Guys, we need to understand this. Men, we need an orgasm for sexual satisfaction. Women do not. That was a discovery for me when I first figured that out about women and my wife, is that, they can actually be sexually satisfied without having a full-blown orgasm. Men, we are sexually frustrated if we don't have that orgasm. But a man's orgasm is typically short, intense, and physically oriented, and it's solitary. We have one. A woman's orgasm is much slower, more intense, emotionally oriented, and at least potentially multiple. She can have multiple orgasms in one sexual encounter. In other words, as some scholars put this, and I'll make a book recommendation here in just a moment, men are like microwaves, but women are like crock-pots. I just love that analogy because that's exactly what it is. Men are like microwaves. We're, boom, instant heat. We are just like, we turn on and there we go. Women are like crock-pots. It's a slow cooking process. But crock-pots, they get hot and they stay hot longer. Microwave, instant heat, turn it on. And that is just a perfect word picture to show you the sexual differences between most, generally speaking, between men and women. And we need to get this through our head, guys, because there is a difference between sex and making love. There is a difference between sex and making love. What do I mean by that? The act of sex is what most guys are focused on. The foreplay, the emotional attachment, the verbal affirmation, the fun romanticism. That's what the woman wants. That's what it means to make love, to enjoy one another, to build a relationship, not just the act of sex. And guys, we can be really guilty of this. We get lazy. We don't put in the time and the effort to make love to our spouse. Rather, we just want sex. And as a result, this is where most guys go wrong. We're too fast, too hard, don't talk enough, and we don't show love in other ways. I can't tell you how many women say, and have told me, that the sexiest thing their husband has ever done is do the dishes for them. Help them around the house. Play with the kids. Do something to show your love for your wife. Serve her. Help her. Speak to her. The 5 love languages. Show affection. Show her in all 4 sorts of various ways that you love her, you care for her, you prize her. Many guys, they're just too fast. We just want what we want. And guys, I'm trying not to be insensitive here, but this is why we're doing this marriage course. Is so many times I've talked to couples, the woman feels like she gets raped every single day. She doesn't feel loved. She doesn't feel cherished. She doesn't feel like she has a gentle, caring lover. She feels like she's married a monster who only thinks about himself, who holds her down, rapes her, and walks out of the room. Now, sadly, that happens very real in some marriages where she is actually reluctant and he just forces himself upon her over and over again. Okay, guys, that's rape. That's not making love. But it's amazing to me how many women are like that. Not physically, like the husband would never do that. Like if she ever said, hey, I'm just not up for it, let's not do it today. Okay. Like the guy says, okay, no problem. I mean, I know a lot of guys like that. But she might not be physically being raped because she's submitting to it. She's participating in it. But emotionally, mentally, what's going through her head is she's not there. She doesn't want to be there. She's not enjoying it. She's not doing it willingly, really. She's just voluntarily letting him have it. Now, does that have to happen sometimes? Does it, is it wrong for a woman to give herself even when she's not in the mood? No, it's not wrong. 1 Corinthians 7, describes that your body is not your own. You can give yourself to your spouse. I understand those principles. But my friends, that should not be the long-term modus operandi of your sex life and marriage. A wife needs to feel like a loving, cherished partner who willingly, eagerly participates. Now, there's tough. I get it. Guys, I get it. This is a hard area. What happens when kids come along? It's harder. It's harder for women to get into it. Their body has changed. They feel more insecure. Menopause hits. And they have this falling out of any sort of sexual desire. Can that happen? Yes. Can that complicate a marriage, sex life and marriage? Yes. But you got to talk about these things. You got to communicate. You got to be on the same page so that you can talk through this. And it's a source of teamwork, mutual service towards one another, not pulling in opposite directions and putting a wedge in your relationship because you're ignoring one another's expectations and desires and you're simply trouncing on ahead. Don't do that. Don't do that. Where do most women go wrong? Most make assumptions and they don't communicate clearly. A lot of women are emotionally, relationally upset at their husband. Let's face it, the guy doesn't even realize it. We can kind of be stupid sometimes. We can be a little dense. We don't know why you're mad, right? We walk in the door and you won't talk to us, and we're like, "What did I do?" And we genuinely don't know. And sometimes the woman, she uses sex as a tool for manipulation. She says, I just want to control my husband, and I want him to do what I want him to do, and so I'm just going to withhold sex, and I'm going to make him do what I want him to do before I give him sex. Okay, is that service-oriented? What's the whole fundamental premise of marriage? Serve your spouse. Be selfless, not selfish. That is in every area of marriage, including sex. A lot of women use this, marital intimacy as a weapon against their husband. Don't do it. Don't do it, because that man is going to start resenting you. He's going to start viewing you as a hen-picking, nag. And he's going to become emotionally distant. He's going to become dissatisfied. That's when affairs happen. Don't do it. Guard your marriage. Let me make a couple practical suggestions before we wrap it up. First of all, I get this from a resource that I would greatly recommend to you. And I thought I had a copy just sitting there on my shelf, but I can't find it. It's called His Brain, Her Brain. His Brain, Her Brain, my favorite marriage handbook, or just book on marriage, extra biblical, outside of the Bible, book on marriage. I get this list from that resource, His Brain, Her Brain, by Walt and Barb Larimore. I'll give you that again at the end. But guys, this is I find this very helpful. Here is love making A to Z. How do you make love to your spouse? Here's how you do it. Number 1, accessorize. Number 2, acknowledge, anticipate, attend to, brag about, care for your wife, caress her, carry for her. Be a gentleman, open the door, carry in the groceries, whatever. Clothe, buy her stuff, compliment, console her, cuddle her, defend her. Someone, dumps on your wife, come up to her defense, stand up for her, show her that you care about her. Die for her, be willing to do that, dream of her, embrace her, empathize, entertain her, excite, fascinate, fix things for her. Oh boy, when I'm doing projects around the house, I'm like Mr. Handyman. That's like the sexiest thing I can do for my wife. She loves it. Fix things, forgive, gratify, hug, humor, idolize, indulge, massage, nuzzle, oblige, pacify, pamper, phone. Give her a phone call every once in a while. Placate, praise, protect, relish, romance, sanctify, savor, serenade. Some of us can't sing very well, but, forgive us. But, hey, have you tried recently trying to be romantic? Smooch, soothe, spoil, squeeze, stimulate, stroke, support, tantalize, tease, trust, worship together. Pray, go to church, read the Bible. Give some spiritual leadership to your family. The point is, I love this list because it gives you an insight, guys, into how to get to the heart of your wife. And when your wife is truly smitten and in love with you, now there's actually, she's warming up to the idea of sex. She actually is more attracted to you when she feels emotionally secure. So do these things. So here's your homework. You guys need to sit down and write these down. Or you can pause, the recording, write them down, rewind, whatever you need. Write these down. You need to sit down and ask these questions to each other. All right, this is your homework assignment. Ask these questions, fill out the answers, and we can go over them later if necessary. Number one, what do you really enjoy about your sex life? Ask each other this. Just sit down and communicate. Most of the problem in a sex life, many problems in a sex life come from lack of communication. You just don't talk to your spouse. Sit down. Ask, what do you really enjoy about our sex life? What pleases you? What feels best and most comfortable for you? What would make it better for you? What would make you feel more comfortable? What's your idea of a perfect romantic sexual encounter? What can I do to be more romantic with you? How can I be a better lover? How can I be a better sex partner? When we're together sexually, do you ever feel like a sex object? Ooh, that's an important one to ask. It might hurt. The answer might hurt, but get to the bottom of it. Get honest. What makes you feel that way? How can I change that? Number 6, how do you feel about the frequency of our lovemaking? How can we meet each other's sexual needs? This is totally normal, right? You ask the same question. Hey, how often do you have sex? And the guy says, oh, hardly ever, like 4 times a week. And the woman says, oh, I have it like all the time, like 4 times a week. We come from different perspectives, don't we? But the point is, talk it out. How do you feel about our frequency? How can we meet one another's needs? Even when our sexual appetites are different. Number 7, what barriers will we need to overcome for both of us to be satisfied with our sex life? What aspects of our relationship are affecting our sex life, and how can we get started in breaking down these barriers? My friends, if you write down these questions and you have basic, honest conversation with your spouse on these issues, wow, it will amaze you how honest you can be and how many issues might surface, but how you can now, identifying the issue, you can address it. You can start working through some of these things. Let me make 2 more recommendations, then we're done. There's that book recommendation. If I love that book. It comes from a science perspective. The guy's actually a doctor. It's written, the husband-wife team, they kind of team up to write the book together. And it's really a fascinating resource about the differences between the male and female brain, personalities, physiology, psychology, etc., and how it is so informative on helping you understand your spouse, whether emotionally, physically, sexually, whatever. Very helpful book recommendation. So I would recommend, if you're into further reading, read that book. But the other option you can do is I actually taught through that book at a marriage conference, spring of 2020, and those audio files, and I think it's like 5 different lectures, we talked through the differences between men, women, and I just basically used that book as a format, and I taught through it. And we had about 15 couples there, 20 couples. I think we had 40 people there. And it was a fun marriage conference. We just had a great time, good interaction. It was just a blessing. Those audio files are available for you at rubymountainbible.com. Check that out. The free, no charge. Just go on there, download them, stream them, whatever. Listen to those lectures. I give a whole lecture in that, which covers like 2 or 3 chapters in their book on the sexual differences between men and women. And we get into some of these nitty-gritty details on how we can learn better to sexually satisfy our spouse, to be sensitive and gentle and loving and kind and emotionally engaged in our relationships. Which I'm telling you, if you listen to what I'm saying and you listen to the way God has designed it, it will pay immense dividends. You invest in your relationship, it's amazing how it pays off. Or you can just say, this Jeff guy's ridiculous. And you can walk away and not heed any of my advice. That's your choice, but I'm just telling you, you're going to regret it. So I just encourage you to take these things seriously. Continue to invest in your marriages. Let's close in prayer, and then we'll be done for today. Father, thank you for this time. I pray that you would please be with these couples as they ponder these very practical, important aspects of marriage when it comes to our sexual intimacy and the blessing it can be, but the problem and the source of frustration and discontentment it can be when not done properly. God, help us as marriages, in our marriages, help us as couples to do this properly according to the way you have designed it. Be with these couples as they sit down, write down those questions, as they talk through these things, as they interview one another. Give them wisdom, give them honesty, give them humility. Help them, Lord, to uncover and understand intimacy, uncover the issues in their sex relationship, and help them overcome it for your honor and for your glory. So we commit ourselves to you afresh. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, sure love you guys. We'll get together next time for the next course. Thanks so much. Lord bless.